Father Gabriel's tires crunched on the gravel road as he pulled up to the small, aging church. The weathered stone structure stood silent beneath a heavy, overcast sky, its once pristine exterior marred by decades of wear. A crowd had gathered in front, murmuring, their eyes wide with fear and awe. Camera flashes from local news crews popped intermittently, illuminating the entrance. Father Gabriel stepped out of his car, his hand tightening on the worn leather of his Bible. He wasn't one to indulge in superstition, miracles, or curses. The call from Father Mateo, the parish's priest, had been vague but urgent. A weeping statue, he'd said. Blood. Ridiculous, Gabriel thought. But the unease settled into his stomach the moment he saw the commotion. Something was wrong here. Inside the church, a stifling silence blanketed the air. The scent of incense hung heavy, mixing with the faint metallic tang of blood. Father Mateo, a short, balding man in his 60s, greeted him at the door, his face pale and drawn. "Thank you for coming, Gabriel," Mateo said, his voice hushed. "It started 2 nights ago. The statue of the Virgin Mary. It's been bleeding." Gabriel followed Mateo down the narrow aisle, the church's stained glass windows casting a dim colored light across the pews. In the center of the altar stood the statue, a serene figure of the Virgin Mary, her hands clasped in prayer, her face cast downward. And then Gabriel saw it, a single dark streak of blood running down from the statue's left eye, dried and crusted on her pale cheek. He inhaled sharply, stepping closer. His rational mind searched for an explanation. Condensation? Rust in the pipes? Someone's cruel prank? "I've had the statue examined," Mateo said, wringing his hands. "No sign of tampering. The blood? It appeared on its own." Gabriel's eyes narrowed. He reached out, hesitant, his fingertips brushing the cold stone. A drop of fresh blood welled at the corner of the statue's eye and rolled down her cheek, falling to the marble floor with an almost inaudible plop. Cold washed over him. He jerked his hand back, staring at the blood now staining his skin. "It was real. You saw that, didn't you?" Mateo's voice cracked. "It's not just me. It's not just the others. This is happening." Gabriel's heartbeat quickened, but he kept his composure. There must be an explanation. Something we're missing. He glanced around the altar, searching for anything. Hidden tubes, a malfunction in the old building's heating system. Anything to debunk this disturbing scene. But there was nothing. Just the empty church, the silent statue, and the steady drip of blood. He knelt beside the altar, pressing his fingers against the floor where the blood had pooled. It was warm. His breath caught in his throat. He stood quickly, wiping his hand on his cassock. "We'll have to investigate further. Keep this quiet for now." Mateo nodded, his eyes darting toward the entrance. "I tried, but the news got out. They're already outside. The bishop wants this handled discreetly. He's concerned about the media attention." Gabriel's lips pressed into a thin line. This wasn't just about curiosity. If this wasn't some hoax, if the blood was real, then something darker was at play. He had seen strange things during his years as a priest, things that defied logic. But this... "I'll stay tonight," Gabriel said, his voice firm. "We'll see if it happens again. If it's a trick, we'll catch it. If not, we'll pray for guidance." Father Mateo nodded, visibly relieved. "Thank you." As Gabriel turned to leave, he felt a sudden chill pass through the church. The air grew dense, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were watching. His eyes flicked back to the statue. The Virgin Mary stared down at him, her stone face impassive, save for the dark, wet streaks that marred her perfect features. Gabriel exited the church, the heavy wooden door creaking as it closed behind him. The crowd outside had swelled, whispers growing into frantic questions as they saw his face. But he said nothing, because for the first time in years, Father Gabriel wasn't sure what to believe. The church was dark, save for the dim glow of candlelight flickering near the altar. Father Gabriel sat alone in the front pew, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. The stone-cold touch of the blood on his hand still haunted him, lingering in the back of his mind. Father Mateo had long since retired for the night, but Gabriel couldn't rest. Not yet. He stood and approached the statue again, this time in the quiet of the empty church. The Virgin Mary's face remained tear-streaked, but no fresh blood had appeared since earlier. Still, the unease crawled under his skin. He needed answers. Gabriel made his way to the church's vestry, where dusty shelves held decades, no, centuries, of parish records. Old wooden boxes, their edges frayed with time, sat untouched for years. The smell of mildew hung thick in the air as he lit the small desk lamp, its weak light casting long shadows across the room. His fingers traced the spines of weathered books, searching for anything that might explain the statue's strange bleeding. He stopped at a large, crumbling tome labeled Records of the Parish, 1600s. Opening it carefully, he skimmed the faded ink, struggling to make out the old script. The entries were mostly mundane. Baptisms, marriages, confessions. But one page, near the middle of the book, caught his eye. The handwriting shifted, growing shaky and erratic, as if the scribe had been in a hurry. The entry was dated 1642, but large sections had been crossed out, blacked over so thickly that Gabriel couldn't decipher the original text. All that remained were the words, "A woman of sin, cast out," followed by the Lord's justice. A chill ran down Gabriel's spine. Cast out? The mention of justice seemed wrong. It was too vague, too harsh. Whatever happened, the church had wanted to forget it. His fingers traced the ink, feeling the ridges left by the quill. Why would they cover this up? He needed to know more. Rising from the desk, Gabriel reached for a stack of files tucked in the back of the room, older documents sealed in a wooden box. The lock on the box was ancient, rusted with time, but with a quick tug, it gave way. Inside, wrapped in yellowed parchment, he found a single letter, unsigned and without a recipient. The ink was faded, but still legible. The sins of the past must remain hidden. No one can know what was done. We must bury it. This cannot leave the church, ever. Rising from the desk, Gabriel reached for a stack of files tucked in the back of the room. Older documents sealed in a wooden box. The lock on the box was ancient, rusted with time, but with a quick tug, it gave way. Inside, wrapped in yellowed parchment, he found a single letter, unsigned and without a recipient. The ink was faded but still legible. The sins of the past must remain hidden. No one can know what was done. We must bury it. This cannot leave the church, ever. Gabriel's heart raced. The weight of secrecy, long buried by time, began to crush down on him. But why? What had the church done? And why was the statue reacting now, after all these years? He slid the letter back into the box and shut it quietly. As he did, a cold draft swept through the vestry, extinguishing the lamp's weak light in an instant. The room plunged into darkness, and Gabriel froze, his breath catching in his throat. In the silence, he heard it, a whisper. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. It sounded like the distant murmur of a woman's voice, the words unintelligible, but filled with sorrow and anger. Gabriel's pulse quickened. He turned slowly, scanning the darkened room. Nothing. The whisper faded into the walls, as if the church itself had spoken. His grip tightened on the edge of the desk. There was something here, something old and angry. He could feel it. Taking a deep breath, he stood and hurried back to the chapel. The statue of the Virgin Mary loomed in the dim light, her weeping face unchanged. But the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt heavier, thicker, like something unseen was watching. Gabriel knelt before the statue, his hands trembling as he clasped them in prayer. He whispered the words of the rosary, but the cold didn't leave. The presence lingered, silent and menacing. As he rose to leave, the whisper returned. Louder this time. It was unmistakable. And just as Gabriel stepped back from the altar, he heard it clearly. Justice. Gabriel stumbled away, his heart pounding. The word echoed in his mind, reverberating through the hollow silence of the church. Whatever was happening here wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a sign from God. It was something else. Something darker, buried in the past, now clawing its way back into the light. And Father Gabriel knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning. Father Gabriel didn't sleep that night. He spent the early hours of the morning pacing the dimly lit church, the whisper of justice still haunting him. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop until the truth was uncovered. The blood, the whispers, the chill, it all pointed to something buried in the past, something the church had tried to erase. By dawn, Gabriel was at the home of Sister Agnes, a retired nun who had served the parish for over 60 years. If anyone knew the church's secrets, it would be her. Sister Agnes lived in a small, modest house on the edge of town. The wooden door creaked open slowly when Gabriel knocked, revealing the frail, elderly nun hunched over her cane. Her gray eyes were sharp, however, and Gabriel sensed that time had not dulled her mind. "Father Gabriel," she greeted, her voice thin but steady. "I was expecting you." Gabriel frowned. "You were?" She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "Word travels fast, even among the old. The statue, the blood. I knew you'd come." He followed her into the living room, where she motioned for him to sit. Gabriel wasted no time. "Sister Agnes, I need to know about the church's past. Something's happening. Something tied to a woman who was cast out. A hidden crime." The room was quiet, except for the faint ticking of a clock. Sister Agnes's face darkened at his words. She lowered herself into an armchair, her fingers tightening around her cane. "It's been over 300 years, she whispered. "But some sins never rest." Gabriel leaned forward. "Tell me, what happened?" Sister Agnes stared at the floor, as if seeing something from long ago. The woman's name was Isolde. She was a healer, a midwife. In those days, women like her were feared, accused of witchcraft. She lived on the outskirts of the town, away from the church. One day, a child died under her care. A fever took him, but the townspeople blamed her. The clergy, under pressure from the townsfolk, condemned her as a witch. Gabriel's chest tightened. She was executed? Sister Agnes nodded, her voice low. They took her in the night, right there in the church. She was tortured until she confessed to sins she didn't commit. Then they buried her. Under the floor, beneath the very stones you walk on every day. They hoped to silence her, to erase her memory, but her spirit has never left. Gabriel sat back, the pieces beginning to fall into place. The bleeding statue, the whispers, justice. "The church covered it up," he murmured. "That's what the records were hiding." Sister Agnes looked him in the eye, her expression grave. "Yes, and now, after centuries of silence, her spirit seeks justice. She won't stop until the truth is known." Gabriel's mind raced. The bleeding statue was no miracle. It was a message, a warning. Isolde's spirit had awakened, and she was making her presence known through the Virgin Mary statue. "Why now?" Gabriel asked. "Why after all this time?" Sister Agnes shook her head. "I don't know. But the church's sins are like buried bones. They always find a way to surface. Perhaps something disturbed her resting place. Perhaps the time has simply come." Gabriel stood, his resolve hardening. "I need to find her remains. If I can put her to rest properly, maybe this will end." Sister Agnes's eyes flickered with a hint of fear. "Be careful, Father. The church won't be pleased if you dig up its secrets. And Isolde's spirit, she's angry, She won't let this go easily. Gabriel nodded, his mind already spinning with plans. He would need to find where Isolde had been buried, somewhere beneath the church floor. But he also knew that confronting the spirit's anger wouldn't be simple. The church's past sins had festered for centuries, and now they were boiling to the surface. That evening, Gabriel returned to the church, the weight of Isolde's story heavy on his shoulders. The empty pews and silent altar felt oppressive, the air thick with unspoken tension. The statue of the Virgin Mary loomed over him, her weeping face now a stark reminder of the injustice buried beneath his feet. He knelt near the altar, his hands pressing against the cold stone floor. Somewhere beneath him, Isolde lay, forgotten by the church, but not by the spirit world. Gabriel whispered a prayer, not for guidance, but for the strength to confront the dark truth. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and a gust of wind rushed through the chapel, extinguishing the candles. Gabriel's breath hitched as the familiar voice, the whisper, returned, clearer than ever. They will pay. The floor beneath him seemed to shift, as if something was stirring below. Gabriel scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. The whisper became louder, more insistent, filling the church with an unnatural energy. They will pay. Gabriel backed away from the altar, his pulse racing. The statue of the Virgin Mary loomed larger in the dark, the blood still staining her face. But now, in the dim light, Gabriel saw something else. Something carved into the base of the statue. Faint letters barely visible in the stone, spelling out a single name. Isolde. Father Gabriel's hand trembled as he traced the letters. The truth was inescapable now. Isolde's spirit had never left, and she would stop at nothing until the church's crime was exposed. And Gabriel knew. There was no turning back. The church was silent when Father Gabriel returned the next night, but the oppressive atmosphere had only thickened. He could feel it in the air. The weight of the secret he now carried, and the anger that radiated from the statue. Isolde's name carved at the base of the Virgin Mary's figure was no coincidence. This was no holy miracle. This was a curse, centuries in the making. Father Gabriel knew he had little time. The spirit was growing stronger, and he needed to act before things escalated further. As he stood before the statue, the cold once again seeped into the room, an invisible force pressing against his chest. He clutched his rosary, whispering a prayer. Suddenly, the faint murmur of footsteps echoed through the church. He spun around to see Father Matteo hurrying toward him, his face pale with worry. "You shouldn't be here," Matteo said breathlessly. "The bishop. He's heard about the blood, the media, the attention. He's ordered this to be stopped. We can't let this get out of control." Gabriel clenched his jaw. "It's already out of control, Matteo. This isn't something we can just cover up anymore. There's a spirit here, Isolde. She was executed by the church, and now she's seeking vengeance." "You shouldn't be here," Matteo said breathlessly. "The bishop. He's heard about the blood, the media, the attention. He's ordered this to be stopped. We can't let this get out of control." Gabriel clenched his jaw. "It's already out of control, Matteo. This isn't something we can just cover up anymore. There's a spirit here, Isolde. She was executed by the church, and now she's seeking vengeance." Father Matteo's face darkened, his eyes flicking to the blood-streaked statue. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low. "There's more at stake than you know. If this gets out, it'll destroy everything we've built here." Gabriel took a step forward, his voice sharp. "This church was built on a lie, and now that lie is coming back to haunt us. We can't ignore it. We have to make this right." Matteo's eyes darted nervously to the statue. "You think you can stop her? You think you can handle this alone?" He shook his head. "This spirit, it's angry. I felt it too. The walls of this church aren't strong enough to contain her anymore." As if in response to his words, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The candles flickered, their flames sputtering as an icy wind whipped through the church. Gabriel's heart pounded in his chest as he turned toward the statue. The blood, it wasn't just a streak anymore. It was pouring from the statue's eyes, a thick crimson stream that dripped down onto the altar, pooling at its feet. The Virgin Mary's serene expression was now a grotesque mask, her face streaked with red as if she were weeping for the sins of the church. Gabriel stepped back, his breath quickening. "Isolde," he whispered, gripping his rosary tighter. "What do you want?" The wind intensified, howling through the church as the pews rattled and the stained glass windows shuddered. The cold was unbearable now, biting through Gabriel's cassock. Father Mateo stumbled back, his face contorted in fear. A sudden crash echoed through the church as one of the tall candlesticks near the altar toppled, smashing to the ground. The sound jolted Gabriel, but his eyes remained fixed on the statue. The blood continued to flow faster now, as if the very stone was bleeding out centuries of anger and pain. And then he heard it again. The whisper. Louder this time, clearer. "Justice!" Gabriel's stomach churned. The word echoed off the walls, filling the empty space with a sound that reverberated deep inside him. It wasn't just a demand. It was a threat. Father Mateo backed toward the doors, his hands trembling. "Gabriel, we have to leave. Now. This isn't something we can stop." But Gabriel knew leaving wouldn't change anything. The spirit was growing more powerful by the minute. And if he didn't act soon, the whole church could be consumed by her rage. He rushed forward, his voice firm despite the fear coursing through him. "Isolde, I know what happened to you. I know the church betrayed you, but this bloodshed won't bring justice. It won't undo the wrong that was done." The wind seemed to pause, if only for a second. The air was thick with tension, the atmosphere crackling like a storm on the verge of breaking. Gabriel swallowed hard. "Let me help you. Let me bring your story to light." For a moment the blood slowed, the drips becoming more deliberate, almost hesitant. But then, without warning, the statue seemed to crack. A loud, grinding sound filled the church as the stone split down the middle. Gabriel watched in horror as pieces of the Virgin Mary's face began to crumble, falling to the ground in chunks. Father Mateo cried out, stumbling back toward the doors, his face ashen. "This is madness. You'll destroy us all." Gabriel ignored him. His focus remained on a statue, where the cracks had revealed something beneath the surface. Inside the hollowed-out stone, there was something dark, something metallic glinting in the dim light. Gabriel stepped forward, heart racing. He reached into the open cavity of the statue, his fingers brushing against cold metal. Pulling it free, he held it up to the light. It was a rusted iron nail. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a random relic. This was one of the nails used to seal Isolde's fate. The church had buried it within the statue, trying to erase the memory of what had been done. Gabriel's grip tightened on the nail, his eyes narrowing. "Isolde, I know your pain. I know what they did to you. But I swear to you, I will make this right." The blood pouring from the statue slowed to a trickle, but the wind still howled, and the walls of the church creaked as if they were straining under the weight of centuries of guilt. Father Mateo was at the door now, his hand on the handle. "You're going to get us killed, Gabriel. Whatever this is, we can't stop it." Gabriel turned to him, his face grim. "We can't hide from it anymore. The only way to end this is to face the truth. I'm going to find where they buried her." With the iron nail clutched in his hand, Gabriel stepped forward, determined to uncover the rest of the secret. But in the pit of his stomach, he knew this wouldn't be the end of Isolde's wrath. It was only the beginning. Father Gabriel sat alone in the church's office, the iron nail resting on the desk in front of him. His eyes were bloodshot, his mind racing as the weight of his task pressed down on him. The nail, a relic from Isolde's execution, was the key to uncovering the truth. But Gabriel knew that once he did, there would be no going back. The church had hidden the crime for centuries, and now the truth threatened to tear everything apart. He glanced at the old parish records spread across the desk, the words blurring together in his tired eyes. Somewhere beneath the floor of this church lay Isolde's remains, buried in secrecy to protect the institution. Gabriel felt a surge of anger. They had betrayed her then, and now, even in death, the church was still trying to keep her silenced. The door creaked open, and Father Matteo entered, his face pale and strained. He closed the door quietly, glancing at the nail before meeting Gabriel's gaze. "They're coming," Matteo said, his voice low. "The bishop has ordered an investigation. They'll shut this place down if they find out what you've been doing. We can't let this get out." Gabriel leaned back in his chair, the exhaustion clear in his eyes. "It's already too late, Matteo. The truth is here. We can't keep hiding behind rituals and prayers while a woman's soul is trapped, demanding justice. You saw what happened last night. The bleeding, the statue breaking apart. We can't stop this unless we make it right." Matteo's hands trembled as he paced the room. "Do you think the bishop cares about justice? They'll destroy us, Gabriel. The church, the parish, everything we've worked for." Gabriel stood, the nail clutched tightly in his hand. It was never ours to keep. This church was built on a lie. And now that lie is catching up to us. Father Matteo's expression hardened, fear turning into anger. "You're throwing away your career for a woman who's been dead for centuries. Do you think exposing this will bring her peace? Or will it just bring more destruction?" Gabriel's resolve wavered for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had dedicated his life to the church, to his faith, to protecting the sanctity of this institution. But how could he stand by when that very institution had committed such a grave sin? The sound of footsteps echoed through the church, followed by a faint murmur. Gabriel and Matteo turned as the doors opened, revealing a small crowd gathering in the chapel. Curious townspeople, drawn by the rumors of the bleeding statue. Some came with cameras, others with prayer books, but all of them with questions. Father Gabriel's heart sank. The blood from the statue had sparked a wildfire of attention, and now there was no hiding it. He couldn't back down. Matteo grabbed his arm, his grip tight. "You still have time to walk away. Let the bishop handle it. Let the church handle it. But don't throw away everything over this." Gabriel pulled free, his eyes burning with determination. "I'm not throwing anything away, Matteo. I'm giving her what she deserves." Without another word, Gabriel stormed out of the office, making his way toward the altar where the statue of the Virgin Mary stood, now cracked and stained with blood. The crowd murmured in awe as they saw him approach, their eyes wide with fear and anticipation. Gabriel stepped up to the statue, the iron nail still in his hand. He looked down at the altar, the floor beneath it. This was where it happened. This was where they buried her. With a swift motion, Gabriel drove the iron nail into the stone floor. The sound echoed through the church like a gunshot, and the crowd gasped, stepping back in shock. Father Matteo stood frozen at the entrance, his face drained of color. "Isolde!" Gabriel's voice rang out firm and clear. "I know you're here. I know what they did to you. And I swear to you, I will make it right." The wind picked up again, a cold gust sweeping through the church as the candles flickered wildly. The crowd began to murmur in fear, some crossing themselves, others backing toward the door. But Gabriel stood firm, his hand still gripping the nail buried in the floor. The air grew dense, and the temperature plummeted as the familiar voice returned, louder and more furious than ever before. "Justice!" Suddenly, the ground beneath Gabriel's feet rumbled, and the stone floor cracked, spreading outward from the spot where the nail had been driven in. The crowd screamed, scrambling toward the exits as the church shook violently. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the stained glass windows rattled in their frames. Father Gabriel held his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was it, the moment of reckoning. Isolde's spirit was growing stronger, and if he didn't find her remains soon, the entire church would collapse under the weight of her anger. He dropped to his knees, desperately pulling at the stones beneath the altar, the crack widening with each second. The floor gave way, revealing a shallow grave, a pile of bones wrapped in decaying fabric. Isolde's remains. Gabriel stared at the sight, his breath catching in his throat. The bones were fragile, ancient, but the weight of the injustice they carried was palpable. Father Matteo stood at a distance, frozen in shock as the full truth was laid bare before him. The crowd had fled, leaving only the two priests in the broken church. Gabriel reached into the grave, his hand trembling as he touched Isolde's remains. "Isolde, I will make this right. I will tell the world what happened to you." The wind howled, and the whisper came again, this time softer, almost relieved. "Justice." The blood on the statue stopped flowing. The wind stilled. The air in the church grew warm again, the oppressive weight lifting as if the spirit had finally been heard. Gabriel closed his eyes, exhaustion washing over him. It wasn't over yet. The church still had to answer for its sins. But at least now, Isolde's spirit could begin to rest. He rose slowly, turning to Father Matteo, who stood speechless in the doorway. "We have to tell them," Gabriel said, his voice hoarse. "We have to tell them everything." Matteo shook his head, his face pale. "The church won't let us." Gabriel's eyes narrowed. "Then I'll make sure they do." The church was in ruins. Cracks snaked across the stone floor, debris scattered from the tremors that had shaken the building to its core. The blood-streaked statue of the Virgin Mary loomed over Father Gabriel, her once serene face now shattered, revealing the hollow cavity where Isolde's remains had been hidden for centuries. Dust hung thick in the air, and the heavy silence was punctuated only by Gabriel's labored breaths. But he wasn't alone. Father Matteo stood frozen in the doorway, his face drained of color, eyes wide with disbelief. Outside, the crowd had fled, terrified by the shaking walls and supernatural force they couldn't understand. The church was empty, except for the two priests and the bones of a woman long dead. Gabriel knelt by the exposed grave, staring at the fragile, crumbling bones of Isolde. He had found her, but now came the hardest part, bringing her the justice she had been denied for centuries. His hands trembled as he touched the remains, a feeling of sorrow and rage washing over him. Isolde's spirit wasn't satisfied. Not yet. He had promised to make things right, but deep down, Gabriel knew the church would fight him at every step. They would deny it all, erase it, just as they had tried to erase her. But the spirit's vengeance wasn't going to wait. Suddenly, a cold gust swept through the church, chilling Gabriel to his core. The air grew thick, oppressive, and the familiar whisper echoed through the broken walls. "They must pay." Gabriel froze, his pulse quickening. The voice was no longer faint. It was loud, commanding, filled with a fury that shook him to his very soul. He stood quickly, backing away from the grave, as the air seemed to shimmer with a dark energy. The candles flickered wildly, and the stone walls groaned under an unseen pressure. "Isolde," Gabriel whispered, his heart racing. "I found you. I'll make sure the truth is known. But this vengeance won't bring peace." The air crackled, and a shadow swept across the walls. Shapeless but filled with malice, Gabriel's breath hitched. It was her, Isolde's spirit, no longer a whisper but a tangible force, twisted by centuries of betrayal. The whisper returned, louder this time, filled with rage. They must pay. The church must fall. Gabriel's stomach churned as he glanced toward Father Matteo, who stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror. "You don't have to do this," Gabriel pleaded. "I will expose the truth." The church will answer for its sins. But the spirit's anger wasn't so easily quelled. The wind whipped through the church, rattling the stained glass windows until they shattered, raining down colored shards. Gabriel shielded his face as the air filled with the sharp sound of breaking glass. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Father Mateo jumped, his voice shaky as he stumbled toward Gabriel. What's happening? Gabriel didn't answer. He knew. Isolde's spirit wasn't going to stop until the church was brought to its knees. Until those responsible, even in death, were made to suffer. The walls groaned louder now, as if the very structure was straining under the weight of her fury. The cracks in the floor widened, snaking toward the altar. Gabriel turned toward Father Mateo, his voice urgent. "We need to get out of here. Now." But as they turned to flee, the pews rattled violently, slamming into each other as if an invisible force were blocking their path. The exit was sealed. Father Mateo's face was pale with fear. "We're trapped. We're trapped in here." Gabriel's mind raced. There had to be a way to stop this. He couldn't let the church be destroyed, not like this. Not without making things right. He looked back at the shattered statue, the blood now drying on the floor. He had to make Isolde hear him. He had to reach her. Grabbing the iron nail from the ground, Gabriel stepped forward, raising it in the air. "Isolde!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the church. "I will expose them. I swear it." The wind stilled for a moment, the oppressive weight in the air lifting slightly. The dark shadow hovering over the walls hesitated, as if waiting. Gabriel took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "The church betrayed you, but it will no longer hide its sins. I will bring your story to light. But this destruction, this won't bring peace. It will only bring more pain." The shadow seemed to shift, flickering across the walls as if considering his words. The air was still heavy with tension, but for a moment, the shaking of the church subsided. Gabriel stepped closer to the grave, kneeling beside Isolde's bones. "I will make sure they pay, but let me do it the right way." For a heartbeat, the church was silent, the air still and cold. Gabriel held his breath, praying that his words had reached her. But then, without warning, the floor beneath him cracked wide open. The earth shifted violently, and Gabriel was thrown backward, crashing into the pews. Father Mateo cried out as the church was rocked by another tremor, more violent than before. The shadow swirled, growing larger, darker, until it consumed the walls of the church. And then the voice came again, furious and final. "They must all fall." Gabriel struggled to his feet, his vision blurred from the impact. The church was falling apart around them, and the spirit's wrath was unstoppable. He staggered toward the altar, his mind racing. There was no reasoning with her now. Isolde's pain had festered for too long, and her desire for revenge was too great. But if Gabriel couldn't stop her, then the only thing left to do was get out. If he could. "Mateo!" Gabriel shouted, trying to find his fellow priest amid the chaos. The pews had toppled and debris was falling from the ceiling. The air was thick with dust, and Gabriel's lungs burned with each breath. Father Mateo was by the door, pounding on it with desperate hands, but it was sealed tight, held shut by the spirit's power. Gabriel rushed to him, grabbing his arm. "We have to find another way out." But before they could move, the final tremor hit. The floor split wide, and the altar collapsed with a deafening crash. The walls groaned, and the roof above them creaked, ready to cave in at any moment. Isolde's shadow loomed over them, dark and terrible, her vengeance now fully unleashed. Gabriel's heart pounded in his chest as he pulled Mateo toward the back of the church, away from the falling debris. The only way out was through the vestry, a small side door that led to the outside. "Come on!" Gabriel shouted, dragging Mateo with him as the walls began to give way. They reached the vestry just as the roof caved in, a deafening roar of destruction filling the air. Dust and debris rained down behind them as they burst through the door, stumbling into the night. The church collapsed in on itself, the ancient stones crumbling under the weight of centuries-old guilt and the fury of a wrong spirit. Gabriel fell to his knees in the dirt, gasping for breath. Father Mateo collapsed beside him, his face streaked with dust and sweat. They had made it out, but barely. As Gabriel stared at the smoking ruins of the church, he knew one thing for certain. Isolde's vengeance was far from over. The church lay in ruins behind them, its ancient stone walls reduced to rubble, smoke still rising from the debris. Father Gabriel stood at the edge of the destruction, his breath ragged, staring at the collapsed structure that had once stood as a symbol of faith and sanctuary. But now, it was a graveyard of secrets, torn apart by Isolde's fury. Father Mateo sat nearby, slumped against a broken piece of the wall, his face streaked with dust, disbelief etched into his features. The silence that had settled over the scene was heavy, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Gabriel's hands still trembled from the chaos they had escaped. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Isolde's spirit was still out there, still vengeful, and though the church had crumbled, the weight of her justice remained. As the dust began to settle, the faint sound of approaching footsteps reached Gabriel's ears. He turned, spotting a small group of townspeople hesitantly making their way toward the wreckage. They had witnessed the collapse from a distance, but none dared come closer until now. Among them were reporters, their cameras ready, eager to capture the destruction. Gabriel knew the time had come. The truth, buried for centuries, could no longer remain hidden. He stepped forward, raising a hand to stop the crowd from approaching any further. He could see the questions in their eyes: fear, confusion, and disbelief. But now he had to be the one to answer them. One of the reporters, a young woman with a notepad and camera, stepped forward. "Father Gabriel, what happened here? Is it true what they're saying? That the statue—" Gabriel cut her off, his voice hoarse but steady. "This is no miracle. This is the result of a crime. A crime committed centuries ago by this very church." The crowd murmured, some crossing themselves in shock. The reporter's pen stilled, her eyes widening. A crime? What crime? Gabriel clenched his fists, the weight of the truth heavy on his shoulders. 300 years ago, a woman named Isolde was executed by the church for crimes she didn't commit. They accused her of witchcraft, tortured her, and buried her beneath this very church, her name erased from history. But her spirit never rested. He pointed to the rubble where the Virgin Mary's statue had once stood. That statue was built to cover the truth, to bury the past. But Isolde's spirit has awakened, demanding justice for the sins committed against her. The crowd gasped, whispers spreading like wildfire through the group. Gabriel could see the disbelief and horror spreading across their faces. Father Mateo stood shakily, his voice weak. "Gabriel, don't." But Gabriel wasn't done. He turned toward the gathered reporters, his voice rising above the murmurs. "The church tried to bury this secret, but the past can't be erased." Isolde's spirit sought justice, and the blood weeping from that statue was a sign of her anger. This destruction, it was her vengeance. The reporter looked stunned, her pen scratching furiously on her notepad. But what happens now? Is the spirit still— Gabriel held up a hand. Isolde's spirit is still out there, and she will not rest until the full truth is known. The church must answer for its sins. We must bring the truth to light. Suddenly, the wind picked up again, a cold gust sweeping through the ruins. Gabriel stiffened, his eyes scanning the area. He felt it. The same dark energy he had felt inside the church, the presence of Isolde's spirit. A low, haunting whisper echoed through the air. Justice. Gabriel's pulse quickened. The crowd looked around nervously, some backing away from the ruins. The temperature dropped sharply, and Gabriel knew Isolde was watching, her fury still unresolved. He turned back to the crowd, his voice filled with urgency. "I need your help. The world needs to know the truth. Isolde's story must be told. If the church refuses to acknowledge it, we will make sure it's heard." Father Matteo's face paled, but he said nothing. He knew there was no stopping Gabriel now. The crowd began to murmur again, some nodding in agreement, others still unsure. The reporters snapped photos of the wreckage, their cameras capturing the destruction, the fear, and the lingering presence of something far beyond their understanding. Gabriel felt the weight of Isolde's gaze on him. He couldn't see her, but he knew she was there, waiting, watching. He knelt by the remains of the statue, whispering a prayer under his breath. "I will bring them to justice, Isolde. I swear it." The air around him seemed to shift, the cold easing slightly. For a moment, Gabriel thought he heard her voice again, soft, almost relieved. "Justice." And then, just as quickly as it had come, the presence was gone. The wind died down, and the church ruins stood still, bathed in the soft light of the setting sun. But Gabriel knew the battle wasn't over. He stood, facing the crowd with a newfound determination. The church had fallen, but the truth would rise from its ashes. That night, Gabriel sat at his desk, his fingers tracing the worn pages of Isolde's story. The old records and letters now spread before him. The world had to know. He would write it all down. The full account of her execution, the church's betrayal, and the vengeance that had shaken the very foundations of faith. The phone on his desk rang, breaking the silence. He answered it with a quiet voice. "Father Gabriel." A pause. Then a voice spoke on the other end, low and foreboding. "You've made a grave mistake, Gabriel. The church doesn't forget those who betray it." Gabriel's heart sank, but his resolve did not waver. He had expected this. "I'm not betraying the church. I'm saving it from itself." The line went dead. Gabriel hung up the phone, his mind racing. The church would come for him, just as it had come for Isolde centuries ago. But this time, he was ready. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the stack of papers before him. Tomorrow, he would begin writing. Tomorrow, the truth would be told. The sun rose slowly over the ruins of the church, casting long shadows across the rubble. Father Gabriel sat at his desk, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. Papers were strewn across the desk, each one detailing the forgotten history of Isolde, a wrongful execution, and the church's attempt to erase her existence. Gabriel had spent the night writing, each word a painful reminder of the church's betrayal. He had promised Isolde justice, and now the promise was written in ink, ready to be revealed to the world. But with the truth came consequences. A knock on the door startled him. Gabriel stood, his body aching from the long hours of writing, and opened the door to find Father Matteo standing in the hall, his expression grim. "Gabriel," Matteo said, his voice low, "the bishop knows what you've done. They're coming for you." Gabriel nodded, unsurprised. He had known from the moment he'd driven the iron nail into the church floor that this day would come. The church wouldn't let him walk away after exposing its darkest secret. Still, he had hoped for more time. "I'm ready," Gabriel said quietly, stepping aside to let Matteo in. Matteo looked around the small room, his eyes falling on the stack of papers sitting on the desk. "You've written everything down." "Everything," Gabriel confirmed. Isolde's story, the cover-up, the collapse of the church, it's all there. The world will know the truth. Matteo's face tightened, a mix of fear and sorrow. "They'll destroy you for this. You know that, right? They'll discredit you, take away everything you've worked for. You'll lose the priesthood." Gabriel's gaze hardened. "I already lost it, Matteo, the moment I chose the truth over the lies." The room fell silent, the weight of Gabriel's words hanging between them. Matteo shifted uneasily, glancing out the window toward the ruins of the church. Isolde's spirit. Do you think it's really gone? Gabriel took a deep breath, his mind flashing back to the moment in the ruins when he'd heard the whisper fade into the air. She's at peace, I think. But the damage she caused, no one will forget that. Matteo nodded slowly, but his eyes remained uncertain. The church isn't going to let this go, Gabriel. They'll send more than just threats. Gabriel knew he was right. The call he had received the night before was only the beginning. The church's power extended far beyond the small town, and now Gabriel had become its enemy. I'm not afraid of them, Gabriel said, his voice steady. Isolde was innocent, and she suffered for it. I won't let her be forgotten again. Matteo hesitated, his brow furrowed with worry. What if it's not enough? What if the world doesn't listen? Gabriel met his gaze, unflinching. The truth has a way of finding its way to the light, no matter how hard people try to bury it. Matteo opened his mouth to speak, but stopped when they both heard the sound of approaching cars outside. Gabriel glanced out the window and saw 2 black sedans pulling up to the rectory. The bishop's men had arrived. Matteo swallowed hard. They're here. Gabriel nodded and turned back to his desk. He gathered the papers into a neat stack, placing them in a worn leather satchel. He wasn't going to run. This wasn't about saving himself. It was about making sure the truth was told, no matter the cost. There was another knock on the door, this one louder, more insistent. Gabriel gave Matteo a reassuring look and crossed the room to answer it. 2 men in black suits stood at the door, their expressions cold and formal. One of them stepped forward, holding up an official-looking document. Father Gabriel, you are being relieved of your duties, effective immediately, the man said. His voice was devoid of emotion, as if he were reciting a script. You are to surrender any church property and leave the rectory at once. Gabriel stared at the man, his heart steady. And what of the truth? The man's eyes flickered with something. Surprise, perhaps, but he quickly recovered. That's not for you to decide anymore, Father. Gabriel stepped aside, letting the men enter the room. He had expected this. They would strip him of his title, his position, everything he had spent his life building. But they couldn't take the truth. As the men moved toward his desk, Gabriel clutched the satchel tightly to his chest. I'm leaving, as you've asked. But I won't be silent. The man nearest to him paused, his expression hardening. You're making a mistake, Father. The church will protect its own. You'll be left with nothing. Gabriel's gaze never wavered. They'll have nothing. But Isolde will have justice. The men exchanged a glance before nodding curtly. Take your things and go. Gabriel didn't wait for them to say more. He picked up the satchel and turned to Matteo, who stood silently by the door, his face pale. Matteo, Gabriel said, his voice soft but firm. Take care of the parish. The people need you now more than ever. Matteo nodded weakly, his eyes filled with guilt and fear. I will. With that, Gabriel walked out the door, his step sure and steady. The men from the bishop's office didn't try to stop him. He knew they wouldn't. They had what they came for. But Gabriel had something more powerful than a title or a position. He had the truth, and he was going to share it. That afternoon, Gabriel sat in a small cafe in a neighboring town, the satchel beside him. He sipped his coffee slowly, watching as people passed by on the street, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface of the world they knew. He had sent Isolde's story to the media, to newspapers, to anyone who would listen. Whether they chose to publish it or not was beyond his control, but he had done what he set out to do. He had fulfilled his promise. As he sat there, his mind still heavy with the events of the past days, a soft breeze blew through the open window. Gabriel closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. The tension that had gripped him since that first night in the church began to ease, if only slightly. In the distance, he thought he heard a faint whisper carried on the wind. Justice. Gabriel smiled to himself, knowing that somewhere, somehow, Isolde had found peace. But for him, the fight was only beginning. Thank you so much for watching. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping tales and deep dives into the mysteries of folklore and the supernatural. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions about the story. Feel free to share them in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the unknown.